Hello and welcome to this game review. So it started as quite an innocent looking opening. Black developed quite sensibly until here white played rook g1, claiming that he will go g4, g5. This should be quite obvious, but of course the opening can't really be played like this very successfully. White can't be any better here. Black has not really done anything wrong to warrant such an attack, and white's pieces are not very well coordinated, so it makes sense in such positions to open up the position, especially as we have developed quite sensibly. And playing something like c5 should come to mind, playing knight c6, trying to already open up the center, and when it is open, the knight on h4, the rook on g1 will start to really not make any sense. So these are the opening principles, right? When our opponent is not developing, keeping his king in the center, we should look for ways to open up the position as quickly as possible. But h6 is fine, knight goes back, the bishop goes back, and knight e4, and white takes. And here black decides to take back with the bishop, but this is a bit too soft. This allows white to at least finish development. So at this point, black could have more or less got a winning position after taking with the pawn. Now this knight has only one square. If here, then this knight is trapped. And here we get this position where black has the simple plan of playing c5 to open up more lines for his bishops and rooks, developing the knight as well. Maybe the knight can go even to b4, to d3. Well, white kind of has no plan. Black also could play f5. Just be careful about d5 at some point, but f5 is definitely a plan, along with bishop h4 to target this pawn. For example, here, let's say queen c2 or something, we could play even f5 and taking even with the rook to start counter-attacking on f2, and this shouldn't really work out for white too well. So here it was a bit soft taking with the bishop. Again, black has to understand that he is the one pressing here. White is breaking all the opening principles, so he should be punished. And he should be punished by not being allowed to finish development. Turn knight e2, again c5, knight a6. Well, a lot of ideas, mainly either f5 or knight b4 to d3, or bishop h4, maybe even then queen can go to f6. But instead now white is allowed to finish development, and bishop b4 is just helping white bring his king towards the king side, as on h1, if the king went, then his position would kind of start to make sense, as he can start playing on the g file. So instead, probably again something like f5, trying to get some kind of play. For example, if white takes, we can now give a check, because now the queen will be able to come out, can give another check. The rook can go to f5, the queen can go to f6. And we have simple plans on the f file, while white is more or less down a bishop, and also his king is quite weak. Okay, bishop b4. So now the king comes out to f3, and this was a very bad decision by black taking on f3, because now white has the bishop pair. Black still hasn't really developed his pieces, and he's not really doing anything either. f5 doesn't really do much because we can't take back with the rook. So unfortunately white is just a lot better here, and the king is only weak in the very short term, if it will get enough time to go to h1. So this should have been calculated. Of course, if we can somehow use the position of the opponent's king in the near future, then this is good. But if we don't, then we are just down the bishop pair. The bishops will be quite dangerous, and white has the plan of g5. So instead, again, something like f5, keeping the bishop on e4. If white ever takes, then this is of course lost because of the f file, and white's king is going to be extremely weak. But now white is better, because, well, he should go to g2, of course, to h1. The pawn is defended, the queen can come out, and it's not clear how black is supposed to finish his development. Well, not finish development, but get counterplay, because, for example, queen e2, king h1, the rook can go to g3, and eventually the queen will get expelled, and maybe like f4, g5, rook g4. So black doesn't really have much compensation for the bishop pair. So king e2 instead, now knight d7, queen f1, the knight is coming, but again black is playing very softly. While white is not coordinated enough, black should look for ways to create problems. For example, taking here, play c5 or e5 trying to open up the position at least somewhat to make use of the opponent's weak king. Because as long as the position is closed, the king being in the center does not really matter. So even here, opening principles should be abided by. So if our opponent's king is in the center and we are fully developed, we must open the position. Now a knight f6, knight h7, but this is just horribly slow. We cannot play chess like this. Moving the knight to h7. Now white has just an easy attack with f4. Now e5 is impossible. Next, he can even play queen g3 to exchange queens to get a better endgame. But it's not clear what black is trying to do here. g5 is the next move. And white is more or less winning because of the simple plan of attacking on the king side. But white takes on h7, which is a horrible decision, giving up such a good bishop for such a horrible knight. And now black doesn't really have any problems. After g5, white even goes to an endgame where he has more pawn islands. Well, exactly 2 because of the isolated pawn on h2. No attack will ever happen here as there's not enough pieces. And black even has the better bishop because the pawns are on light squares, fixed on light squares, while this bishop is blocked. So this was a horrible decision by white, but now it's time for black to try to play for a win. So now the king moves up to g7. White also opens the c-file, which is definitely not in his favor, as the rooks are over here. Now rook ac8, and black kind of takes over. King g7, rook c1, and now black should find a way to create some kind of weaknesses to have some progress. And in this very classical endgame, black has a couple of ideas. Mainly he should use his more active rook, but it's not clear how. Because now black cannot really attack a2, because a4 will always happen, and if b3, then white will be able to easily defend with his king. So this is why black has to use the technique of fixing weaknesses. And currently we can try to fix the weakness on a2 by playing the move b5. And next, if needed, we will even play b4. So firstly, we stop a4, because now if a4, this would be terrible, as this pawn will be terribly weak. For example, after this, we can even play bishop b4. And in a rook endgame, this rook doesn't make any sense at all. As often happens in chess, when an attack doesn't work out, the pieces are left feeling very stupid. And now the rook endgame is winning because black will pick up this pawn, and also he will be left with a better structure. And so b5 has the idea of rook c6 to a6. Or even rook h8 if white moves away the rook. Okay, rook c6 now, and now a4 is allowed. So this was a big positional mistake. And from here black loses his advantage, doesn't really do too much. Bishop d6, rook c8, rook h8. But exchanging the rooks does not really favor black, as white's rook was a lot worse than black's. White's rook was defending passively on this square. So instead black should focus on the center and queen side, as the opponent's rook is over here. So maybe f6, with the idea to take, play e5, maybe f5 at some point, maybe g5 even, to improve the king. For example, if white does nothing, like bishop c3, could improve the position a little bit, preparing e5 or e5 directly. And even though white is kind of solid, his position is quite sad. At some point, black could consider a bishop exchange, as again, the rooks on the board will favor black. Black also has the idea of b5, trying to create a weakness on a4. And if white takes, then the a file would be open. So generally, we shouldn't rush with such decisions, when the endgame should not be played very quickly. But now rook h8, and now this should be more or less a draw, because black doesn't really have any targets. The queen side is fixed on light squares. And here black plays g5, which makes sense if we are trying to play for a win. But I'm not sure we can really win at this point, and we should just keep the pawns on light squares, just to improve the king a little bit. And here it's actually white that has to prove something. The threat is king h6, king h5, king h4, or even king f4 to f5, trying to improve the position of the king. And black's bishop is somewhat better because of the fixed pawns on light squares. But g5, the king arrives, but after f5 there's not really much happening here. Black could play e5, but again, it's not clear what the point would be here. Also, it's not really possible because of the hanged pawn. So now the position is more or less equal. Black could improve his position a bit by playing b5, getting some space on the king side, but this should just end in a draw. White tries to play for a win, and here again Black shouldn't really do anything. The threat of playing h4, h5 is not that big. For example, bishop g7, h4, bishop f6, h5, the king can move away. And due to this pawn being on e6, the white king can't really do anything. If h6, there will always be king g6. So white can't play for a win. There's no way to break through anywhere. There's not that much to do here. After e5, now this f5 square is weakened, which means white will have to get through this square on f5. And here d4 was a big blunder. Already the position is quite uncomfortable, and of course the time situation is horrible as well. We should have played a lot faster in this game, as there weren't that many difficult decisions. And here Black should reconcile with the h5 threat. The point of h5 is to kick away the king to go to f5 with his own king. So here, for example, king f6 would be a nice prophylactic move to not allow the pawn to go to h5 with check. And now we can do some kind of move to allow the king to go to e5, for example, bishop c3, to answer this with king e5. And the king will be quite active. We will push our queenside pawn, while white can push his h-pawn, and it should be more or less equal. The problem with d4 now is h5, and now if we move the king randomly after bishop f4, white is gaining tempo attacking our bishop. We cannot go to a pawn endgame because he has the outside passed pawn, and once we move, white will be in time to play king f5, either to go pick up this pawn or simply help his own pawn march forward. So now the king activity is in white's favor. But white doesn't find this, and now we can move away the bishop, and now after h5, king f6, white is not able to go to f5. But king h7 was played, which is very bad for endgame principles. Now the king is out of play completely. It cannot do anything at all, as it cannot even go back into the game. And after king f5, the game is more or less over. Black can draw by some miracle with bishop g3, but in practice this is more or less impossible. And now white has a simple plan of going to the king's and queen side or picking up this pawn, and it should be winning for white. Instead, of course, we should keep the king as active as possible. With bishop g5, we can just go to e6, staying in contact with the f5 square. This pawn is not really going anywhere, as we can always play bishop e5. And the more pawns are off the board, the better for us. For example, in this position, at some point we can already start sacrificing the bishop for the pawn. Though here we have our own pawn as well, so it's not really clear how white is supposed to make progress. Instead, king h7, and now the position is hopeless because black is down a king, and playing the endgame without a king is more or less impossible, which was shown in the game. Here the bishop is also trapped, so it's more or less resignable at this point. So quite an unfortunate endgame. Firstly, black shouldn't have even gotten an endgame and should have played a lot more aggressively, as the opponent was not really developing his pieces. He was playing against the principles of the opening, and we must study the principles of the opening so that we don't allow our opponent to do whatever he wants, like g4, g5. We must look for ways to punish him, and here, for example, this would actually create a threat, and then play f5 to open up the position while the opponent's king is in the center.